Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us to learn more about protecting our children from the harmful levels of almost constant RF radiation that are being emitted in today's technology-dense classrooms. My name is Patty Wood. I'm the founder and executive director of Grassroots Environmental Education, an environmental health nonprofit that created TechSafe schools. Our work over the past several decades has been focused on protecting the most vulnerable in our society from common environmental exposures. One of our earlier programs, the ChildSafe School, looked at chronic low-level exposures to chemicals found in school environments, including pesticides, diesel exhaust, petrochemical cleaners, synthetic turf, and even wireless radiation in classrooms. Because of the rapid growth of technology-based learning utilizing wireless technology and the coinciding growing body of research showing the potential for both acute and chronic harm to our children, as well as our teachers and school staff, we were compelled to address RF radiation in schools as an urgent matter and in a holistic manner. We have been very fortunate to collaborate with a team of distinguished attorneys on issues of liability, a highly regarded building biologist on the technical aspects of dealing with both wireless and wired connections to the internet, and then today's panel of experts on the science of RF radiation. So that we can have ample time for questions, I would like to introduce our first speaker now. Dr. Paul Héroux. Dr. Paul Héroux is a scientist with extensive experience in physics, engineering, and health sciences. He is an associate professor at McGill University, where he is the current director of the Occupational Health Program. Dr. Héroux also serves as the medical scientist in the Department of Surgery at McGill University Health Center. Recent work in Dr. Héroux's laboratory has uncovered a mechanism by which extra low frequency magnetic fields interact with unstable molecular structures such as hydrogen bridges, altering the ability of protons to tunnel from one molecule to another. Welcome, Dr. Héroux.
Thank you very much. The Federal Communications Commission does not protect our children from electromagnetic radiation. To understand why you should rise to change the present situation, you have to understand history. And so let's go into it a little bit. The first item I want to show you is from the year of your independence in 1776. That's when the problem started, so to speak. And as you know, Adam Smith is the high priest of capitalism, and he believed that markets were best managed by industry itself. But he also warned us about widening the market, and he was very suspicious of the motives of merchants in very many ways. So essentially, Smith warned us about letting the merchants make the rules, because they would make the rules to their own advantage. So apparently this warning, which is very, very old, was entirely forgotten. And the consequences of this have been many. For example, in 1923, we decided to include lead in gasoline instead of ethanol. And this is to the benefit, of course, of General Motors Corporation. And of course, a number of children lost permanently IQ points as a result of this exposure. Now, we were awakened as well to air pollution by an event specifically in 1952, where 14,000 died in a few days. And we realized suddenly that air pollution was out of control. What this means is that society is not always very astute when it comes to managing these problems. War critically depends on radar and radio communications for its success. So this had a lot of impact. So in 1914, there was this way of sending messages across a battlefield. And of course, this was improved immensely during the war in that you could now use radios. We got rid of the bicycle and we now had modern ways essentially to send messages. So of course, this was incredibly important to the military, which is why in 1953, when the risks were evaluated, the military were a big ingredient in the equation. At the US Navy conference in '53, Commander Brody remarked that people are always getting hurt in the service. So the fact that there might be effects of electromagnetic radiation, especially chronic ones, is not of great interest to us. At the bottom, I state, after all, no one loses wars because of cancer or sterility. So as far as the official record was concerned, no one had died as a result of exposure to RF radiation. And the Department of Defense cannot afford a program that would avert all risks. Where does this put us? In 1966, a standard was struck, crystallized by a committee made of 15 people. 10 were from the Armed Service, one from the Petroleum Institute, one from Space Administration, one from General Dynamics, one from the US Treasury, and one from the US Public Health Service. So essentially, it was set in the interests and in a context of military conflict. So are exposures appropriate for a fighter pilot in his F-16 acceptable for your daughter in school? This is essentially what the military need as a means of telecommunications in a battlefield. And of course, the more telecommunications you can implement from the point of view of the military, absolutely the better. But does this relate to children in school? And my view is that it does not at all. So what do we know about the health impacts of the electromagnetic radiation that we have lived through until now? Well, what happened is that the military passed a baton to industry, and this baton was the thermal limit. It was determined that there was no problem with electromagnetic radiation but for the military unless thermal limits, in other words, heating of tissue, was reached. This is a very convenient limit because it essentially legalizes astronomical levels of electromagnetic radiation in the environment. And industry could not resist passing this concept along. So this concept went from the military to the American National Standards Institute, to the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, to the Federal Communications Commission, unchanged until this day. And we see what has happened in our society in the meanwhile. We went from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G and to 5G and the Internet of Things, and the transition to digital while maintaining a heat criterion for protection. Essentially, this criterion was maintained. So this is inappropriate. So what happened over time is that at the beginning, it was the military here that were exposed, and in present day environments, everyone is exposed. And we can see here with these successive curves that display frequency versus intensity with a very condensed log scale that exposures are really very rapidly increasing to the point where, as you can see here in these little bumps, at the telecommunications limit, we are approaching, at the telecommunications frequencies, we're approaching the thermal limits. So our environment has changed drastically, as well as the number of people exposed, which essentially today means everyone. So what evidence do we have that our health is affected by this radiation? Well, taking simply the one issue of cancer, we have truly crushing evidence that this agent, electromagnetic radiation, as used in telecommunications, is a cancer-causing agent. So essentially, we have studies by Chu, Repaccioli, Lerchel, NTP, and Ramazzini. I will talk a little bit, very briefly, about each one of them, but together, they involve 4,288 rats and 2,180 mice. And I am often told by legislators that, well, Dr. Héroux, you are very biased because you are a specialist of this question. But I like to point out that these rats and these mice are very difficult to bias individually in conversation. They develop tumors while their friends who were not exposed to radiation did not. So this evidence is very difficult to disable. In two, a near fourfold increase in primary malignancies in the exposed. Note that this study had no practical impact in the sense that it was swept under the carpet. In 1997, Repiccioli used a bunch of essentially of animals who were predisposed to having leukemia. And in spite of the fact that they spontaneously had a lot of leukemia, he was able to double the amount of leukemia in these animals. And then we have the recently released National Toxicology Program studies that show what is called here clear evidence of carcinogenicity. You cannot be any clearer than that. So why aren't our officials and leaders listening? This was not a small study. It lasted 10 years, cost more than $25 million, and was very seriously done. Why didn't it have any more consequences? This is the Ramazzini study. While the NTP study referred to the use of a cell phone, the Ramazzini study investigated what happens when you're near a cellular base station. In other words, when you're in the neighborhood of these base stations that provide the signal to your phone. And again, they confirmed in a spectacular way that this agent is carcinogenic. So we also have evidence from epidemiology from two thick reports by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, both on low frequencies and on radio frequencies, and they have both been linked to increases in certain types of cancers. So I want to finish the issue of cancer by quoting my colleague Anthony Miller of the University of Toronto. He is very, very worried about what is happening to American children for ages 0 to 4. Between 2000 and 2010, there was an increase annually of 0.6% per year in cancers. In ages 15 to 19, between 2000 and 2008, it increased annually by 1% per year. So we have indications that our environment is affecting the rate of disease. So we know that the International Agency for Research on Cancer will soon reassess electromagnetic radiation, which is currently a 2B level, perhaps to become a class 1 carcinogen. So are you willing to deploy a class 1 carcinogen in your community? Class 1 means it's a confirmed human carcinogen. Now, the federal communications safety limits, they have arguments to support these high limits. Telecom signals use non-ionizing frequencies, and they say that the fields are too weak. They are subthermal, they don't heat anything. But this is entirely nonsensical because it draws attention to things that are unimportant. We have to understand that the body is already ionized. And I quote here Dr. Gary Woods, who sat with me on the New Hampshire Commission. He says, it makes no sense to refer to ionization when you want to assess the impact on already ionized chemicals in the body. Small fields or viruses obviously cannot harm you. Really, we've got direct experience that this isn't true. It's not about the energy of molecules in a thermal soup. It's about electrons and protons. So essentially, the safety limits of the FCC are looking in the wrong direction. Wi-Fi in schools, library, and our homes. Where do our children go to be safe? Well, there is an intention by the sellers, by Village Telco, as an example here, to put as many of these connections, wireless connections, in the classroom as possible, typically 30 in a classroom situation. But you have many instances in which you can equip classrooms for stations to connect with one another. So essentially, you could have a lot more communications than 30 going on at the same time. This means that essentially these classrooms could attain and reach the FCC limits. But as far as industry does not reach them, they are allowed to commercialize equipment. So let's look at recent results on the effects of microwave radiation on the brain. And this is a report by the military medical research branch of the Chinese military. And of course, they are worried about the effects of radiation on their soldiers. Then, of course, they don't have any young children in their army who have developing brains. So, but they state that the brain has been recognized as one of the organs that is most vulnerable to microwave radiation. And where? In the hippocampus, the seat of memory. So this is a very troubling result. We have continuous exposures to GSM radiation that changes the morphology of neural cells in culture. In other words, you are going to change the anatomy of the brain. And especially if it is developing, these changes in the brain could be permanent. Exposure to cell phone radiation upregulates apoptosis in primary cultures of neurons and astrocytes. Well, apoptosis is another name for the death of cells. So what this means is that these exposures, although they were a little bit high, they were also relatively brief, could kill neural cells. They can kill cells in the brain. So this is another troubling report. And then the relationship between cognition function and hippocampus in long-term microwave exposure. And here we're dealing, of course, with rats. And we can see that if we expose them at levels below what is legal in the United States, you have effects on their mental processes, on their cognition, and on hippocampus structure. And you know that industry is very keen about penetrating schools because it creates a lifelong habit. And this habit of wireless use would be prolonged in college students. Well, college students who are dependent on mobile cell phones have altered gray matter volume. So what this means is that chronic exposure to this radiation has dire consequences on our children and our students. So essentially, what we need to do, this is the end of the presentation, you need to get up and recognize what your environment is becoming and reflecting on whether you want this to continue or whether something should be done about it. If nothing is done about it, well, Smith's prediction about the commerce taking over everything to the detriment of our health and our children will come true. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. And to be sure that we have adequate time for questions and to hear more from Dr. Hérault in a few minutes, I want to move on with my introduction of our next panelist, Dr. Devra Davis. Dr. Devra Davis founded the Environmental Health Trust in 2007 to provide basic research and education about environmental health hazards and to promote constructive governmental policies locally, nationally, and internationally. Currently visiting professor of medicine at the Hebrew University Hadassah Medical School in Jerusalem, Dr. Davis lectures at UC San Francisco and Berkeley, Dartmouth, Georgetown, Harvard, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as other major universities throughout the world. Dr. Davis has also authored more than 200 publications in books and journals, ranging from The Lancet and Journal of the American Medical Association to Scientific American and the New York Times. She is the author of 3 award-winning books, including her latest book, Disconnect: The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation, What the Industry is Doing to Hide It, and How to Protect Your Family. I would like to introduce Devra now. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to share my slides with you. I'm going to talk today about the evidence on wireless radiation and the growing amount of wireless radiation and how this is affecting our children, particularly because, as Dr. Hérault just indicated, there's growing exposures and there's no consideration being made whatsoever to the need to test and evaluate the fact that children are not just little adults. There's a large body of science showing that wireless radiation can cause harm at the current levels permitted. And I would add that Israel and India are 2 high-tech countries that currently have limits on their tower radiation that is 1/10 of that allowed by the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation. And that level is actually too high, according to studies that Professor Hérault just showed you. And so these are some of the studies that have demonstrated that there are clearly evidence for effects that occur without heat. These are studies that have been done by Dominique Belpalme and David Carpenter. I've participated in a number of studies with Anthony Miller, including one which concluded that in 2019, if one were to look at all of the evidence at that time, including experimental evidence and human evidence, you would conclude that wireless radiation is a human carcinogen. Now, I want to stress something about animal studies, since Professor Haru took some time to show you some of those data. Every compound that we know for sure produces cancer in people, because we have sick or dead people with evidence of exposure and cancer. Every single compound that causes cancer in people produces it in animals when adequately studied. And that is why we have to pay attention to what the animals are trying to tell us. We have data that I'm going to show you on exposure modeling. We have experimental studies that look either at whole animals or cell cultures. And then finally, we have epidemiologic studies in people. It's always been very difficult to get animals to make cell phone calls. It's always been very difficult to get animals to behave as humans do. But we have data from the National Toxicology Program that clearly shows, according to multiple peer reviews, that there is clear evidence of cancer, of the highly malignant cancers of the brain and of the nerve in the heart that are very rare, but very malignant. And that is enough reason for concern. But I'm going to tell you, there are many other health effects in children, particularly, that we have to pay attention to. But first, let me show you something about exposure. Here's what we know. Children are more vulnerable to wireless radiation. Their skulls are thinner, their heads are smaller, and they have more fluid within the brain. And because of that, studies that have been done experimentally, some of which I'm going to show you, clearly show that some of the most important parts of the brain, the hippocampus you heard about just before, can be affected by and are exposed greatly to wireless radiation. And they absorb more wireless radiation than a big, large adult, who, by the way, came from the 97th percentile of military recruits from the US Army. And we know that there are exposures that take place for children to the brain, the eyes, the endocrine and reproductive systems. And those exposures are really important. Now, the FCC standards, if you can call them standards, were actually set 25 years ago. That's when the FCC standards were set. And I want to show you here this guy with his big brain. This man was the model for this, basically had about a 12-pound head. Think about that when you look at your children, right? So here we have the sample SAM, we call him, standard anthropomorphic mannequin. And SAM was made to measure phone calls with a spacer between his brain and the phone, but SAM is also used to measure wireless exposures from iPads and other devices. They use his body, seen here at the bottom of my screen. There's supposedly, and you'll see it's all flat body with a liquid poured into it, and that is what we do to estimate exposures. We know that those estimations are not relevant to today's experience. Just look at this one. This is modeling that I've done with my colleagues in Brazil, where we've looked at 1 millimeter cubes that you can model in a three-dimensional space. And you can see here that a child who's holding a tablet just about 6 inches from his body, which his arms don't even reach much longer, that child will absorb the most radiation into the part of the brain that is still developing. Think about that. This radiation from this tablet is the same frequency that the microwave oven uses. The microwave oven operates at 1,000 watts of power. The tablet operates at less than 1, ideally, but it's not the power of the radiation that we have to worry about. It's the pulse. It's the repeated pattern that's sending the information. It's the information content on the frequency, not just the frequency itself. So the old approach to look just at the frequencies is clearly inappropriate. This is a slide that just compares the absorption. If you look carefully into the child, you'll see that the yellow and white is much higher. There's much more absorption that gets into the child. It's almost halfway through their head. And again, with their thinner skulls and their smaller heads, there's much greater absorption. More information on this and the work done by Claudio Fernandez with Environmental Health Trust can be found on our website at ehtrust.org. This is another simulation that we did with Claudio Fernandez. And this, again, is the laptop. Now, you know, they're not marketed as laptops anymore. They're called tablets. They belong on tables. But you see, if you look carefully at this radiation, it gets really into the central area, the abdominal area, because there is no thick skull to protect it. And we actually, with Tony Miller, we have just published a paper showing that the rate of colorectal cancer in people in their 20s and 30s has quadrupled in the past decade in the United States, Iran, Brazil, and the UK. Nobody knows why. And it's a very rare cancer in these young people. But the fact is it's increasing radically. And I believe that this habit of keeping these devices on the body, which our children will do in the classroom, is contributing to the problem. And of course, having a device close to the rectum in the back is a problem as well. I just want to share with you the idea that we have to understand that you get direct exposure, as when the child holds this iPad right over her reproductive organs. You get secondhand exposure, as when these children are sitting very close to their dad. And what most people don't know is that where the antennas are located, and different devices have antennas in different positions. So you need to know that in order to make a decision about how you can reduce your exposures. And then finally, we have third-hand exposure from these towers, which in Israel and France and Belgium, it is against the law to put a cell tower on or near a school or a playground. It's against the law. We somehow missed that memo in a big way. And as Professor Hiruz indicated, we missed it in part because the lobbying efforts of this industry are incredible. And that is why I'm so grateful to Grassroots Environmental Education for what they are doing in launching this project, because I know many people are unaware of the fact that exposures can take place firsthand, just like with cigarette smoke, secondhand, and as well, third hand. Now, a number of studies have been published recently, and they all show an increase in oxidative stress. Well, what is that exactly? Free radicals are produced, and they are like cougars in the body. They go and find things that are weak and kill them, attack them, or cause them to grow cancer. And so what we see is by 2015, Yakomenko did a review of the literature, and he found the great majority of studies showed an increase in this oxidative stress, which is a precursor to damage to the nervous system, to starting cancer to grow, et cetera. Most recently, a very distinguished expert group advised the Swiss government that the majority of animal and cell culture studies show evidence of oxidative stress, and that therefore they warn that the very young, the old, and those with pre-existing conditions are at considerable risk. Now, the work that Professor Hiruz showed you has increasingly confirmed the understanding that wireless radiation causes cancer. In 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified this as a possible carcinogen. Additional determinations have been made by some of the resources here, and I call your attention to our new publication published just before the end of the year with Anthony Miller on the increase in rectal cancer in young adults, because it's a puzzling increase. It's a tragic increase because it's often detected late. Now, wireless radiation clearly affects the brain. And this is a very important research that was done by my colleague Suleiman Kaplan at Antakuz Mayuz University in Turkey, where control animals were not exposed. Exposed animals received exposure to a typical small amount of radiation that you might get from using devices. And what they showed, if you see at the controls at the top, there's a bunch of very nice uniform cells. They all have borders. Cells are supposed to have borders. At the bottom, you can see that the cell borders are gone. And so this is evidence that prenatal exposure can damage the brain in these animals. And remember, we are not rats and mice, but we share most of their genes. And so we're seeing here damage to brain cells, fewer brain cells, and cells with more damage. And other studies show that children who are exposed when their mothers are pregnant and early in life also have more hyperactivity and problems with attention. Experimental studies, again, I'm not going to go through them in great detail because I think they've been covered, except to point out that not only are these studies relevant to cancer, but they're relevant to sperm formation and performance. So we are seeing evidence of the expressions of messenger RNA being affected in a negative way, and we're seeing that the DNA of the brain and of other organs in these animals that are exposed is profoundly affected. But thinking about children in classrooms where they're constantly being encouraged to use devices and there's not an awareness that you're exposing children to something that we know causes cancer in animals and we believe causes cancer in people because we have data. And yet it seems that there's a disconnect between what we know in science and what we're doing to our children right now. If you take human male sperm under controlled conditions and put them under a laptop with no heat being generated, no heat at all, within 4 hours, you can look at those sperm and see markers of damage into how well they swim and how their DNA is shaped. And this in turn influences their capacity to fertilize. And therefore, you see on the left, that huge black bar, that is showing you evidence of sperm fragmentation in the exposed animals compared to the unexposed. I encourage you to be aware that there are many schools around the world that have taken steps to reduce exposure. And in China, Huawei has made a baby safe router that goes to sleep. It's not on all the time. And there are many options to make technology safer through changes in hardware and software, but we have to be more insistent that we demand those kinds of products. This is an example of steps that have been taken in Cyprus, where our colleagues have worked with the hospital there, and the neonatal intensive care unit and the pediatric wing do not have wireless. They've replaced it with Ethernet. So there are cables like this one that I use that are connected to Ethernet. It makes it faster, it's safer, it's more secure. These are some of the policies that other countries have adopted. In France and China, children are not allowed to have cell phones. And many other countries are following suit, often because of concerns about bullying. But in France, for example, they have issued a warning that teenagers should avoid exposing their abdomens to cell phone or other radiation. That's an official French government recommendation. In Israel, they have limited Wi-Fi in nurseries and minimized it in elementary schools. And India and many countries have mandatory labeling about the amount of radiation coming out of phones. So this experiment on our children should come to an end. And we need to make sure people are aware that you can use technology safely and more smart than we are doing now. And with that, we will be able to protect our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. There is clearly a lot of material to cover here, and you have given us a lot to think about. But I would now like to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Toril Gelter. And after Dr. Gelter speaks, we will open up the chat for your questions. Dr. Toril Gelter is a general practitioner and pediatrician with over 30 years of experience. A native of Norway, she studied medicine at the University of Oslo, graduating with honors. She completed her residency in pediatrics at Columbia School of Physicians and Surgeons, and later practiced at the Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital and St. Peter's Hospital, and has worked in a wide range of clinical settings. Dr. Gelter is a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and the Physicians' Health Initiative on Radiation and the Environment. Welcome, Dr. Gelter.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about how children are affected by wireless radiation. And I'm going to review a few case studies, define electrohypersensitivity, discuss the most commonly used diagnosis codes for these problems, and touch on biomarkers. So the first case that I had where I had a 4-year-old boy with sleep difficulties come to my office, And his parents said that he had basically been in their bed for the last 2 years. And it wasn't just a matter of him not being able to go to sleep at night, but he was very hyper, up, wanted to walk around, wanted to eat, play games. And I reviewed the typical sleep hygiene questions that a pediatrician asks. You know, do you have a regular bedtime? Are you drinking caffeinated drinks before you go to bed? On and on. And they were doing all the usual good things. And then they mentioned that they had tried some melatonin the evening before they came to see me, and he seemed to sleep a little bit better that night. And I had just read an article about how wireless radiation can disturb melatonin metabolism. And so I asked them about the exposure in the home, and it was quite considerable, and suggested that they turn off the Wi-Fi router for 12 hours at night, unplug all cordless phones, and turn off the cell phones. And they agreed that they would like to try this before trying other medications or continuing the melatonin. And within a week, he was sleeping in his own bed, no problem, going to bed at a regular time. And the parents were very pleased about this result. Another case I had was a 9-year-old boy with headaches and anxiety. He was going to a parochial school in a large city nearby. The school had very many devices, smart boards, and you name it. The boy told me that he couldn't think straight inside the school, but he said, I can on the football field. He could also say that it had started on the third day of school when he was sitting in the chapel. And he was nervous, and so were the parents, that he had a brain tumor because the headaches were so severe. So I suggested that when I spoke to them on the phone, I just said, well, why don't you just turn the Wi-Fi router off, tonight, and I'll see you tomorrow. And I did a neurological exam. I didn't find any abnormalities on the neurological exam, fortunately. And then they agreed to do the no EMF protocol that I mentioned. And lo and behold, his symptoms subsided substantially in the home, but he continued to have problems at school. The reason I asked parents to turn the Wi-Fi router off for 12 hours at night and not 24/7 initially is because I'm more likely to get the fathers on board with that. In this case, the father actually, had a problem doing the things that I recommended because he was very engaged with the tech industry. I think his employment was in the tech industry. And he said that he preferred to send the child to a psychologist. And so he was lost to follow up. And I am concerned about what happened to him eventually. So the symptoms vary significantly with time and location. If that happens, you got to start thinking about environmental factors. Another boy, the parents had discovered that he had a lot of symptoms, and particularly a rash that came and went. They had figured out that a number of the other symptoms he had decreased when they eliminated wireless radiation in the home. But he continued to have rashes when he went to school for long periods of time that decreased on the weekends and disappeared on longer vacations and during the summer. They did a lot to try and get the school to accommodate him with very limited success. Dr. Oler Johansson has found that you can find abnormalities in skin biopsies in cases like this. An 8-year-old boy with insomnia and learning difficulties. We started with trying to figure out how we were going to get him to sleep better at night, because we all know that if a child has a good quality and good duration of sleep at night, it's much easier for them to learn. So they agreed to unplug the Wi-Fi router 12 hours at night, unplug the cordless phones, turn off the cell phones, and his sleep problems improved substantially. And an interesting thing that happened was that they contacted me in June, and they continued to do low EMF in the home through the summer. And when he went back to school in September, the parents were called into the school for a meeting with school staff. They said there were like 10 people there, principal, you name it, the aides that had been helping him with his learning difficulties, and they all wanted to know what the parents, what they had changed, what he was doing. They really wanted to know what medication they had put him on. And when they explained that they had lowered the Wi-Fi in the home, the school staff were just shocked and had never heard of such a thing before. And they said that he had actually improved 2 grade levels in 2 months. This case here, a 10-year-old boy with nonverbal autism and aggression. They came to me primarily because of the aggression. They were considering putting him on various medications. And I reviewed the wireless radiation that he was exposed to in the home with them and found that it was substantial. And the other thing about this case was that they lived on a military base. And so I thought if wireless radiation was contributing to his problems, maybe going low EMF in the home wouldn't help. Since there would be radar and so many other things outside the home. But we still decided, they agreed to do a 1 to 2 week trial. And this child actually said a full sentence within 3 days. He said, "Mom, pass me the scissors." Mom's jaw dropped. His jaw dropped. She'd never heard him say a word before. He had never had been able to say anything that anybody would understand. His aggressive behavior actually went away. They had thought that they would have to institutionalize him. He was not institutionalized before. He would take a lamp and throw it against the wall. Mom was very petite, so she was concerned, that she couldn't have him at home much longer. The other thing that happened in this case was that mother had a seizure disorder, and the frequency and severity of her seizure disorder improved dramatically with the things they did in their home. This is a teen with electrohypersensitivity. Her name is Jenny Fry, and the photographs are not actual photographs. They are stock images. So she's a 15-year-old attending school in the UK, and she tried repeatedly to get accommodations at school because she got sick from wireless exposure. They had figured this out because mom had similar problems, so they had lowered the exposure in their home, and both mom and the daughter felt better at home, but they were unable to get accommodations in the school. When you have this problem, as you can understand, they also call it the loner sickness because it becomes very difficult to socialize. And unfortunately, eventually this child at 15 committed suicide. The wireless radiation is not affecting just the children in schools, it's also affecting the teachers. I get teachers coming to me with a wide array of problems. Remember, radiation doesn't just affect one cell or one organ in the body. It has the potential to affect every cell, every organ in the body. This teacher noticed that she could think clearly before she went into the classroom. When she got into the classroom, she would get brain fog. She couldn't think clearly. After she came to me, we realized that she actually was standing right underneath a Wi-Fi router. She also had a metal hairpiece in her hair. I have patients that have noticed that if they have metal in or on their body, that seems to accentuate the harmful effects of the EMF radiation, wireless radiation they're exposed to. She was and is a phenomenal teacher, would love to work, but she cannot no longer find a classroom that she can work in anymore. So electrohypersensitivity, here's a lengthy definition by Dr. Erica Mallory Blythe, pediatrician in the UK. It's a multi-system medical condition characterized by physical symptoms associated with anthropogenic electromagnetic field exposure. And similar constellation of symptoms may also be seen in the general population when exposures to RF are higher. It's proven to be a physical response under blinded conditions, and biomarkers are being identified. and mechanisms to explain the reaction are evolving. Guidelines for EHS diagnosis and management have been peer-reviewed and published, which makes it clear that the mainstay of medical management is avoidance of wireless radiation and other EMFs. Disability and compensation cases for those with EHS are already being won and will continue to escalate. So what are the symptoms of electrohypersensitivity? Well, if radiation can affect every cell in the body, there are a lot of different symptoms. You can have anxiety, chest tightness, depression, restlessness, hyperactivity, irritability or fatigue, noise sensitivity, concentration difficulties, headaches we've mentioned, dizziness, ringing in the ears, sleep problems, ringing in the ears. Some people have ringing in the ears that's so bad that they almost don't want to live anymore. Then they go to a rural area, and some people within 24 hours notice that it's dramatically improved. Other people, it can take 10 days. Then they come back to the Bay Area, and within 24 hours, the ringing in the ears is back. Another symptom is anomia, difficulty finding words, burning sensation, urinary urgency, heart palpitations. Dr. Magda Habas has some wonderful YouTubes showing how you bring a device close to a person that's EMF sensitive, and you can see the heart rhythm change. There are blood pressure problems. You can have an increase in blood pressure, hypertension, or hypotension, depending on what kind of vulnerability the individual has and what kind of wireless radiation the person's being exposed to. So electrohypersensitivity is a clinical diagnosis. The patient's story is critical. It's very important to listen to them. You try to identify situations that were retrospectively signal blinded or double blinded. For example, the 8-year-old boy I was talking about that had sleep problems and learning difficulties. In October of that year, he, after doing very well at school and being able to sleep, he regressed and started having learning difficulties again and wasn't able to sleep at night. The parents, mom was wondering, could it be because it's around Halloween? He's eaten a lot of candy. And she just couldn't understand because she didn't think anything had changed in his EMF environment, at least not in the home. And then they discovered that the older sister had turned the Wi-Fi router back on, and mother didn't know and the child didn't know. So they turned it back off again, and his learning difficulties subsided and he was able to sleep again. It's very important to conduct a comprehensive physical exam, get an EMF assessment by a certified EMF consultant or building biologist, and do a thorough differential diagnosis. In the case of environmental factors, do the symptoms vary significantly with time and or locations, or do the symptoms vary significantly with variations in exposure to wireless radiation? I had one mother come to me saying that her child had been diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental problem at the age of 5. And she said, but I don't think it's true because when I take my daughter, the daughter was actually flapping very, very dramatic arm movements. She said, when I take my daughter to my mother, to her grandmother in rural Tennessee, within a week, the flapping goes away. And then she's good. We stay 3-4 weeks. And then when we came back again to the Bay Area, the flapping started. Another family told me about taking their son who had a neurodevelopmental disorder to rural Oregon from the San Francisco Bay Area. And here in the Bay Area, he had high-pitched screaming, head banging, couldn't play with other children. He was 4 at that time. When she went to her sister in rural Oregon, this child was then able to play with other children. The head banging went away, the high-pitched screaming went away. When they drove back to the Bay Area again, on the way around Sacramento, he would start with the high-pitched screaming and head banging again. Unfortunately, this was a divorce situation, so the father wanted the child to stay, and she was unable to move at that time. Biomarkers can be supportive of a a diagnosis of electrohypersensitivity, but they're not pathognomonic. The different biomarkers that can be used are blood, urine, and showing inflammatory markers, increase in histamine, oxidative stress. You can find autoimmune response, antibodies to myelin, which is the lining of the brain, decreased availability of melatonin. Imaging ultrasound studies can show decreased blood flow to the thalamus and limbic system. Functional MRIs show abnormal brain perfusion, and abnormal skin biopsies can be found. The immune system is also can dramatically be shifted. So I'm not going to read all this, but suffice it to say that it would be unfortunate if we had a pandemic where the children are affected. And in international classification of diseases, the European Academy of Environmental Medicine recommends that currently in EMF-related health problems that we use the code for exposure to radiation, Z58.4, and the existing codes for different diseases and symptoms. And for electrohypersensitivity, that we use the code for exposure to radiation, also R68.8, other specified general symptoms and signs, and existing codes for different symptoms until we get a specific code for electrohypersensitivity, which is in the works, and there have been multiple requests to get that going. So who else is concerned other than everybody who's here? The American Academy of Pediatrics is very concerned. This is the professional organization for pediatricians in the United States with over 60,000 members. And they have written multiple letters to the FCC asking them to reevaluate their safety limits. The American Academy of Environmental Physicians has recommended that, for example, smart meters not be placed on schools or homes. California Department of Public Health has issued safety guidelines for cell phones, but unfortunately, it took many years for these to come out, and it was actually Dr. Joel Moskowitz at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health that had to get that released, and it was a very arduous process. The Americans with Disability Act, ADA, recognizes electrohypersensitivity as a disability now that necessitating accommodations. The National Toxicology Program study has been mentioned, and IARC now classifies wireless radiation as a class 2B carcinogen, but it should probably be a 1. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Gelter, for that really important information. I think it helps to know what some of these symptoms are. In fact, one of our questions is, what are the most important symptoms parents should look for that might indicate EHS? And I think maybe you have already answered that question, but there may be more. The other part of that question was, how do we find a doctor who knows about this issue?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, there are very few physicians currently that have much knowledge about this. But here in the Bay Area, I refer people to the Physicians for Safe Technology, MD Safe Tech, and they have a number of referrals. Yes, that would be my primary recommendation. I also, work with primary care doctors and try and educate them. Some are open to this knowledge and some are not. And I don't really take primary care patients any longer, but all my adult patients have to have a primary care doctor. And then I try and educate my patients on how they can educate their doctor. And yeah, so I will mute myself, and maybe Deborah and Paul have some more tips there.
Yes, I think the American Academy of Environmental Medicine is on record as being quite concerned about this issue. And so that's another resource that people might be able to use. But you're quite right, of course, Dr. Jeter. There are not that many physicians, but I think that Physicians for Safe Tech and Dr. Cindy Russell at Stanford and Palo Alto can refer people. And there is the psychiatrist who's in your area as well, who works with children and has had remarkable success. We were with her at the meeting, and I'm sorry right now her name escapes me.
Dr. Victoria Dunkley.
Thank you.
And she has an excellent book called How to Reset Your Child's Brain. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah, and she tells stories very much like the ones you tell of remarkable changes in children. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening to these children when they are exposed, and see the difference when they get out into an environment like the one that I can live in, where there's not much exposure. And you see the change, and yet some of these hipster parents, as you indicated, are just unwilling to even consider it. And it's actually not hard. I think we need to do a better job of explaining that safer technology is actually faster and smarter. I mean, for example, you use less energy if you're using a wired Ethernet connection than you do with the wireless router. That may sound trivial on a household level, but for a school, for a large school, that actually could affect its budget. And we need to start running the numbers and so showing people that there really are economic and public health consequences of the way we're using energy now.
Yes, of course. I have many people in Quebec and even in Canada who call me in relation to this question. And essentially, in terms of referral, it's very difficult here because the physicians who dare to tackle this question are often persecuted, because there is action by people who are hired by telcos or by power companies to intimidate them. So there is a long way to go in order to develop expertise. And after all, when you are curing an electrosensitive person, you're not selling any pills. You're just giving a description of what they should do better. So there's a big difference. Thank you.
I'd like to also bring your attention to Dr. Rena Bray, who has been medical director of the Environmental Health Clinic at the Women's College Hospital in Toronto. She has a very unusual background because she achieved first-class honors in chemical engineering, and then got a master's of science in pharmacology, and then studied medicine in Toronto. And she is now one of the few people with a very active practice, unfortunately with a long wait list, who deals with electromagnetic illness. And she has trained hundreds of medical students and others. And with Dr. Bray, I was able to write a chapter in a medical textbook in environmental medicine in the series by Andrew Weil. And there's a chapter in that book by her and me and others where we talk about some of the same things we've been discussing.
Thank you so much. I have lots of questions here, so let me get the next one here. Is schools look to the WHO, or the World Health Organization, for direction, and their website says that the science on this is inconclusive. So what is happening at the WHO between industry and independent scientists, and why should we wait for public policy to catch up with independent science?
I think I can put a few words in on that. The WHO, in spite of its name, is a political organization. It, of course, it manages, so to speak, the health of the planet, but it has a very good track record of making agreements with industry, in particular the nuclear industry. In other words, they make arrangements with powerful people in society, and to their credit, they are not large enough to oppose them. So unfortunately, although we don't like to think of the world that way, there's power struggles and there's large, I would say, influential bodies that don't necessarily make rational decisions in relation to the health of people. So the World Health Organization is just about to start tackling the problem of air pollution. I mean, in 1948, you had deaths in the United States, you know, from air pollution that was very short term, that was very, very obvious to see. But it took 70 years for a WHO to tackle these problems. You can't trust them to take care of your health. And neither can you trust, of course, the FCC, who is entirely manned by people from industry. Thank you.
So I have an FCC question. So if the FCC's E-rate program only promotes wireless solutions, what can a school do?
There are some legal liabilities. And one of the first things that schools need to understand is that this industry is uninsurable. It's uninsurable. They cannot get insurance to cover health or environmental impacts from electromagnetic fields. I think that that should make the schools concerned. And further, I worked with the California Department of Health on the notice that finally got out, Dr. Jeter. That notice was drafted after meetings that we held in 2009. And so it took a long time, and only after Professor Moskowitz filed a lawsuit did we finally get the guidance released. And the guidance that was released is so much weaker than what they first recommended. And you can see all of this on our website, but just one example. In 2009, they were prepared to issue an advice to all people working for the state of California, which is a lot of people, not to have phones on their bodies and to use speakerphones and headsets and be aware of weak signals in 2009. And that advice to the California working people for the government was deleted.
Okay, so I want to get back to a very basic question that someone had right at the very beginning, because you had mentioned pulsed radiation, Deborah. And the question is, how is pulsed radiation different from other types of radiation, and why is it more dangerous?
I think you can think about a rubber band. A rubber band, it has integrity, and you can stretch it, and you stretch it, and you stretch it. And after about 2,000 or 4,000 stretches, it pops. And the pulses for the signal are like this. They go pop, 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 and repeated pulsing actually can be damaging even at very, very low power. So it's not just the frequency we have to be concerned about. It's not just the power of the frequency we have to be concerned about. It is the pattern of repeated pulsation. And that has been shown to weaken membranes, to release these free radicals, oxidative stress, to work in part through voltage-gated calcium channels and other mechanisms that have been identified that indicate that this repeated pulsation basically snaps the band eventually.
So I have another question here. I've heard that the next generation of tech will use light instead of RF energy. Will that be safer, and when will that be available?
Well, the difference between RF radiation or microwave radiation and light is that light would probably be used by the military as lasers. And lasers can have very, very narrow beams and can have much superior data rates than 5G, for example. So in a sense, there is a hope that the technology of telecommunications through wireless will essentially tame itself. But we shouldn't wait for that. We should use Li-Fi. And of course, light can be immensely more powerful than microwaves in terms of data rate if we have the proper hardware. So yes, there is a hope that technology can solve this problem for itself. But frankly, I wouldn't wait for that, because we see how they're trying to promote desperately a poor product at the moment. Thank you.
And I'd like to add something there. When babies are born yellow, jaundice condition called hyperbilirubinemia, they have too much bilirubin and they're yellow. When babies are born yellow, the therapy for them is to use blue light, 440 nanometers light. And the baby is placed in a lighted bassinet with their eyes covered, and and they are either naked or they have a diaper, because the skin is our largest organ. And blue light in the skin of a newborn baby, which is so thin and delicate and smells so wonderful, as we know, blue light has a biological effect on the circulating bilirubin and actually stimulates the liver of these babies to produce dihydroxyvitamin D, which is what they're deficient in, which is why they are yellow. Now, that is evidence that light has biological effects. Of course, that ultraviolet radiation can cause skin damage and cancer. So I am concerned about any technology that we introduce without adequate safety data. And we need adequate safety data on this. And we do not have it on 5G for sure.
Thanks so much. Well, we're running out of time here, so I'd like to just end by saying that today's discussion was the second of 3 webinars on wireless technologies in schools. The last one will be next Tuesday, the 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's entitled Technical Forum on Reducing Wireless Radiation in Schools. We will be discussing this with a building biologist who has had a lot of experience in moving schools from wireless connections to hardwired connections, as well as just powering down the Wi-Fi that is currently in the school. All of these seminars will be posted on the project's website, techsafeschools.org. We encourage you to watch them again. Some of them were very technical. It would be useful, certainly for me, to listen to them once again. And please share them with the school officials in your own communities. We very much appreciate your taking the time today to learn about this important issue. And I want to give special thanks to our outstanding team of experts who have shared their expertise with us, joining us in the hopes that more people will have a better understanding of this critically important issue again. And I also want to thank Ben Levi for his technical assistance, Doug Wood for putting this all together both on the screen and behind the scenes, and our staff at Grassroots. I just have one more comment from one of our listeners today. This is from one of our colleagues in Massachusetts. And she said, please mention the New York Times series that showed that Silicon Valley executives send their kids to school with no wireless and have their nannies sign contracts that there will be no screens or cell phones around their kids while they are in their care. So I think that's interesting coming from those people who actually created this technology. So please join us next Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time for our last webinar in this series. You can RSVP on the TechSafe Schools website. Once again, techsafeschools.org. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.